Wyoming Territory. Summer of 1874, the wind carried dust across the dry grasslands and the sun dipped low behind the red bluffs when Grace Sutton slipped out the church's back door, her tears already staining the front of her cotton dress. She did not look back. The hymn inside rose from the congregation like a lie. Her chest tightened. Her breath hitched. She kept walking until she reached the rear corner of the small clapboard church, dropped to the dirt and buried her face in her hands. She was 23. Her father had died the year before, leaving her with nothing but a half-rotten house and a worn Bible. The town of Whitestone had been her home since she was a child, but it never felt more like a prison than it did today. Today was supposed to be her wedding day. But the man she was meant to marry had ridden out the night before with another woman, leaving only a folded note and a trail of hoof prints. Grace had stood in front of the mirror this morning, hair pinned up, veil falling over her shoulders, feeling like a fool. Now she cried behind the church where no one would see, or so she thought. The soft crunch of boots in the dry grass made her lift her head. A man stood a few feet away, hat in his hands, eyes steady but not hard. He did not speak. Just crouched beside her, slow and careful like he was approaching a wounded colt, she blinked at him through blurred lashes. "What do you want?" "To sit," he said. "Unless you want me to go." She looked away. "I do not care what you do," he said, nothing more. Sat down beside her in the dirt, his hip a few inches from hers, knees bent, elbows resting on them. He looked out toward the horizon, not at her, and that somehow made her cry harder. She wiped at her cheeks. "You do not even know me." "I know you are hurting," he said. "That is enough." His voice was quiet, deep, and without pity. She glanced at him. He was young, maybe 25, with sun-browned skin and sharp cheekbones. His shirt was worn, his boots dusty, and his hands looked like they had known years of work. "You from around here?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Name is Abram Callahan," he said. "Been driving cattle through the Northern Trail. Stopped 2 days back when a mare threw a shoe, thought I would rest a while. And chose this church to rest at." He looked at her then, eyes clear and steady. "I heard someone crying." Grace's throat tightened again. She looked away, ashamed of her tears, until a sudden laugh escaped her, bitter and soft. "I was supposed to be married today," she said. "I figured," Abram said. She turned to him. "You knew," he nodded. "I saw your dress." She looked down at her lap. The white fabric was dusty now, the hem torn where she had stepped on it running, her hands twisted in it, pulling at the seams. "He left last night, rode out with Martha Weller. Left me a note that said he was sorry." Abram's jaw flexed, not with anger but with something quieter, understanding. "I am not crying because he is gone," Grace said. "I am crying because everyone saw it happen. Because I stood there like a fool while the whole town whispered." "I do not think you are a fool," Abram said. She looked at him, surprised by how steady he sounded. He met her eyes like he meant it. "I think it takes guts to walk out when you are hurting," he added. "Most people just sit inside pretending." Grace blinked. Her heart ached, but something warm pressed against the edges of it. "Why are you really here?" she asked. Abram shrugged. "I was fixing my mare's shoe over across the livery, thought I would walk to the church." Not sure why. She stared at him, unsure if she believed in coincidence but not ready to question it too much. "I grew up here," she said. "I used to sit behind this church during services and draw in the dirt. My mother died when I was 8. Father never much liked me skipping sermons." Abram leaned back on his hands. "I never knew mine. My mother died when I was 10. I took work with cattle so I could eat. Never much liked sermons either." Grace gave him a small smile. "We are a fine pair then," he grinned just a little. Not wide, not bold, but it was real. They sat in silence for a while. The sun dipped lower. The wind stirred her veil where it still clung to her shoulder. "Do you have someplace to be?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said. "The trail I was on is behind me." "Was thinking of heading west." "You could stay a little longer," she said, surprised by her own words. His eyes met hers again. "You want me to?" She nodded. He reached up and gently pulled the veil off her shoulder, folding it into her lap. "You do not need this anymore," he said. She looked down at it, then up at him. "You think there is any good left for me here? I think there is good left for you," he said, "wherever you are." Grace's chest twisted again, but not from pain. Something new stirred beneath the grief hope. Small and trembling, but alive. And for the first time that day, she smiled. He stood and offered his hand. She took it. They walked back around the church together, side by side, while the sun dipped low over the plains. The next morning, Grace Sutton rose before the birds. The house was quiet, save for the old boards groaning beneath her bare feet. She dressed plainly gray calico and a shawl to keep off the chill left by the night, and tied her hair back without fuss. There was no mirror in the kitchen, only the window above the washbasin, where the dawn cast long, soft light across the floor. She pulled the kettle from the hearth and poured water into a tin mug, her hands steady now. The ache in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted less sharp, more like the weight of something being carried, not something crushing her. The knock came just as she set the mug down. She opened the door and found Abram standing with a saddlebag slung over one shoulder and a bundle wrapped in cloth hanging from his hand. "I brought something," he said, holding it out. "Biscuits from the hotel kitchen. I told the cook I'd trade for them, but she said I looked too thin to bargain." Grace stepped aside to let him in. "You do look a bit hollow in the face," he grinned faintly. "Then I'll take the biscuits and the insult." She set them on the table and unwrapped the cloth. They were warm still, soft and browned at the edges. He stood near the door, uncertain. "You can sit," she said. "You came all this way." He lowered himself into the chair across from her. His eyes moved around the room but didn't linger. She saw him notice the cracked plates stacked near the stove, the broom worn down to its knot, the small pile of kindling she hadn't yet split. "How long's it been since anyone helped you with the place?" he asked. "My father passed last spring." Before that, he was too sick to do much. Abram nodded once. "You want help chopping wood? I saw the axe out back." She paused mid-bite. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. She studied him across the table. He didn't speak like a man trying to impress anyone. He offered things like he'd done it before for strangers, probably. For families along the trail who needed a fence mended or a calf pulled from the mud. She wondered how long he'd been doing that, living from one stretch of road to the next, leaving pieces of himself behind with every stop. "I could pay you," she said. He met her eyes. "I'd rather earn my breakfast." She flushed, not from embarrassment but something else, gratitude, tangled up with something she couldn't name yet. After they finished eating, Abram stepped outside. She watched from the window as he shrugged off his coat, picked up the axe and planted his boots firm in the soil. He swung with practiced rhythm, clean, solid strikes, and the wood split beneath him like it had been waiting. Grace didn't interrupt. She washed the dishes slowly, kept the back door open so the sound of the axe could reach her. It was steadying somehow. Like the heartbeat of something honest. By midday, he had stacked a neat pile beneath the lean-to and wiped his hands on a rag she'd set out for him. "I can pay you in stew," she said, standing on the back steps. "Stew sounds fair." He glanced up at the sky. "I was thinking to ride out tomorrow, but I could stay through the week, long as I'm useful." She hesitated at the threshold. "I won't stop you if you need to go. I know." She looked at his face, the sun drawing lines of gold across his cheekbones, dust clinging to the curve of his neck. "But I wouldn't mind if you stayed." Abram let out a breath. "Then I will." Later that evening, they sat on the front porch. She had tied a lantern to the post, and its glow stretched over the steps where they both sat side by side again, not touching. He passed her a small carving, something he'd made from the kindling. A bird, rough and unpainted, wings just beginning to lift from its sides. "It's not fancy," he said. She turned it in her hands. "It's beautiful. Thought you might keep it in case I do leave." "I'd rather you gave it to me while staying." He nodded once, silent. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage from the hills, and somewhere far off a coyote called. Grace leaned back against the rail. "I used to think I'd never get out of this town, then I thought I'd never leave because I was stuck. Now I'm not sure what I want." Abram looked out toward the darkening plains. Sometimes it takes staying still a while to figure out where you're going. She turned toward him. And what about you? You know where you're headed? He looked at her, long and steady. No. But today felt like a place to begin. She held his gaze, and the quiet between them deepened, not heavy, not sad, just full. The lantern swayed in the wind, and Grace reached for the bird carving again. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she wasn't afraid of it anymore. 2 days passed, and Abram didn't leave. Grace found herself moving through her hours differently, not with haste or dread, but with a steadiness that surprised her. She swept the floor without thinking of who might come calling with condolences. She kneaded dough with both hands instead of letting one hang limp in her lap. She no longer lingered at the window waiting for nothing in particular. There was someone splitting fence rails or checking the roofline or leaning against the porch post watching the sky. That afternoon, she stood beside the garden plot behind the house, a hoe in her hand and her skirts pinned up above her ankles. The soil was dry, and crabgrass had crept in where her father's beans once grew. She worked until her arms ached. Abram appeared around the barn just as she paused to stretch her back. "You plan on taming the whole prairie?" he asked, brushing his hands on his trousers. "If I can," she said, wiping her brow, "but I'll settle for a few rows of carrots." He tilted his head, considering the garden. "You ever tried planting with ash?" She blinked. "From the stove, sprinkle it in the soil before you turn it. Helps keep bugs off and loosens the earth." Grace looked down at the dry patch she'd been hacking at. "I never heard that before." He crouched beside her and ran his fingers through the dirt. "Learned it from an old ranch woman up near Powder River. She grew onions the size of melons." Said ash and patience were all it took. Grace watched his hands move, slow and sure, the way he sifted the soil like he was coaxing life out of it. She crouched beside him. "You've been on your own a long time," she said. "Long enough," he answered, "but it's not the years that wear on you. It's the places that don't hold you." She turned the hoe in her hands, then set it down. "How do you know when a place will?" He looked at her, not quick, not searching, just honest. "When you stop looking past it." They stood together, the air warm and still. A cottonwood leaf drifted down from the tree beyond the fence and landed between them. Later, she brought out a pail of stove ash, and he helped her scatter it across the sorry patch of garden. They worked without many words. Not because there was silence between them, but because they didn't need to fill it. That evening, while she filled the kettle and he set kindling in the hearth, she asked, "Have you ever thought of staying anywhere for good?" He stirred the fire. "Sometimes. But I figured no one want me enough to ask. I didn't think I wanted anyone to stay," she said, watching the water begin to steam. "Not until someone did." He didn't answer at first. The flames caught, and he placed another log across the grate. "I've slept in wagons, under brush, beside cattle, in barns too cold to breathe through. But this feels like something I could carry without moving." She turned slowly. "Then maybe you don't have to carry anything right now." He stood and met her eye. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've had enough people leave. I'd like one to stay if he wants to." The kettle began to whistle, soft and rising. Abram stepped closer, close enough she could see the flecks of dust still clinging to his collar. "I want to." They stood there as the sun dropped beneath the edge of the land, the light inside the house catching the soft curve of her face, the lines at the corner of his eyes. Nothing rushed, nothing undone, just two people, quiet and certain, finding peace where there had once been ache. And for the first time in years, the house felt full. The next morning broke overcast, the sky a pale wash of pewter that dulled the edges of the hills. Grace stood at the back fence with her shawl drawn tight, barefoot in the wet grass. She watched the chickens peck at the damp earth and listened to the steady scrape of a whetstone against metal coming from the barn. Abram had taken to sharpening the tools with the kind of quiet focus that never asked for attention. She hadn't asked him to do it. He'd simply risen with the light and gone to work, the same way he'd patched a loose hinge on the smokehouse door without ever mentioning it. When he came out from the barn, sleeves rolled back, blade in hand, she didn't speak right away. He approached her with that same calm he always wore, not slow but unhurried, like he'd found a rhythm to match the land. "There's a spot near the river," Grace said, her fingers tightening around the fence rail. "Used to go there with my mother when I was small." "I haven't been since before the war." Abram leaned against the post beside her. "You want to go now?" She nodded. "If you don't mind." He set the hat on his head. "Lead the way." They walked through the thinning grass, past the edge of town where the cottonwoods grew thicker and the trail narrowed to a footpath. The air smelled of damp earth and wild mint crushed underfoot. Neither of them spoke, but Grace could feel the quiet wasn't empty. It held something careful, like a promise still forming. When they reached the river bend, the water moved slow and clear, carving a deep curve through sandstone and willow. She stepped onto a flat rock near the edge and looked out at the current. "There used to be a wooden cross over there," she said, pointing to a bare patch of ground. "My mother carved it. We planted bluebells around it. They never grew." Abram crouched beside her rock, resting his arms on his knees. "Why the cross?" "She lost a baby before I was born." Said this place made her feel closer to what she couldn't hold. He didn't offer any empty comfort. Just let the wind move between them and the hush of water fill the space. Grace dropped to sit beside him on the rock. "When she died, I tried coming back here. But I kept thinking I'd see her dress in the trees. Couldn't bear it. You feel different now?" "I don't know what I feel, only that I wanted someone else to see it, not to explain it, just to be here." Abram looked out across the water. "I had a brother, name was Ali. He drowned in a cattle pond trying to pull a calf free. I was 15. I never told anyone how long I sat at the edge of that pond afterward, whole night just listening." Grace's fingers curled around the edge of the rock. "You still hear him?" "Sometimes, not in words. Just in the way the wind moves through grass." She turned toward him, and for a long moment neither of them moved. His face was turned to the river, but she could see the memory pull at the corners of his mouth, the way it deepened the shadows near his jaw. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "I never told anyone else," he replied. They sat until the sun broke through the clouds, soft light warming the stones beneath them. A pair of ducks skimmed across the river's surface, their wings lifting water as they rose. When they walked back, Grace reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers closed around hers, not tightly, just enough to steady. That evening, she lit a lamp in the front room and set 2 chairs by the hearth. Abram brought in a bundle of willow branches and fed the fire until it caught. The room glowed with amber light, and the scent of smoke curled into the beams. He pulled a small tin from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "Found this behind the barn, tucked in the rafters." She opened it. Inside were 3 buttons, a yellowed scrap of lace, and a folded note bearing her father's handwriting. She traced the edge of the lace. "It was part of my mother's shawl." Abram didn't ask what the note said. He just waited while she read it. After a minute, she folded it again and placed it back in the tin. "Thank you," he met her eyes. "You want me to stay the night?" She nodded, her voice even. "Yes." He moved to stoke the fire once more but paused. "Not for the work." "No," she said, "not for the work." She lit the second lamp. Shadows stretched long across the floor, and outside the wind shifted through the cottonwoods, steady and low. They sat together in the warmth, the world outside their window still and dark, nothing left to explain. The rain came 2 days later, steady and quiet, soaking the earth in a way that pulled the scent of sage and pine up from the roots. It tapped against the windows of Grace's house while she sat at the table, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea gone cool. Abram stood at the hearth, feeding in one last log from the pile they'd split together, his shirt damp from bringing in the wash just before the skies opened. "Storm'll pass by nightfall," he said. She nodded, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Still, I don't mind it." He leaned his shoulder against the mantel. "I figured as much. You've got the kind of quiet that doesn't mind waiting." "I learned it from being left," she said, then glanced toward him. "But not all waiting ends that way." Abram crossed the room and sat across from her, his hands still damp from the cloth. "I've been thinking on something I wasn't sure I had the right to say." Grace studied him, the way his jaw stayed still, his brow set in thought, not worry. "You can say it. I don't want to leave when the sun comes back, not tomorrow, not next week, not at all if there's a place for me here." She didn't answer right away. The old clock on the wall ticked through the silence. "There's more than a place," she said. "There's a life if you want it," he exhaled once, slow and quiet. "I do." The rain softened against the roof. Grace reached across the table, her hand finding his. "Then we'll build it, not all at once, but steady." He turned her hand over, pressed his thumb to the spot just below her knuckles. "I never thought I'd be wanted beyond what I can do with my hands. Then I'll be the first to prove you wrong." That evening, when the rain had eased to a mist and the chickens began to stir from under the porch, they stepped out into the yard. The soil was dark and rich beneath their boots. Grace walked to the garden plot and knelt, pressing her palm flat to the earth. Abram joined her without a word, crouching beside her. She looked toward him. "I want to plant again, not just carrots and beans, flowers too." He brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "Then we'll plant them. Rows of them if you like." "I do like," she whispered. The next morning they rode into town together. Abram had mended the harness himself, and she'd packed a basket with bread and a small jar of pickled beets to leave with the widow who ran the store. The townsfolk watched them pass with more than a little surprise, but Grace kept her chin high, her hand resting against Abram's arm as naturally as sunlight. Inside the mercantile, she placed an order for nails, a pane of glass to replace the one cracked in the root cellar, and a length of muslin. Abram picked up a sack of seed potatoes. "Good yield if you plant them by early August," the shopkeeper said, eyeing them both. "You two fixing to stay through winter then?" Grace met Abram's eyes before answering. "We're not going anywhere." The man nodded once slowly. "Then I'll set your order aside. And if you've a mind to sell eggs come spring, my shelves are always open." They left with their goods and a small sack of licorice sticks tucked in the bottom of the basket. Abram handed one to her as they walked the horses back down the lane. "I haven't had one of these since I was 10, she said, biting off a piece and smiling. He looked sideways at her. "That's a shame. I figure you deserve 100 more." Back at the house, she hung the muslin in the kitchen window while he saw to the new glass. The light that filtered through it was soft and warm, casting a golden hue over the worn table and the clean floorboards. Outside, the earth steamed as the rain dried, and the garden plot waited. By late summer, green shoots had begun to rise. The ash they'd worked into the soil had done its part. Grace kept a careful ledger of their supplies, and Abram built a coop large enough to hold 6 hens and a rooster. They worked side by side, not out of necessity, but out of a growing rhythm that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choosing each other daily. One morning, as the leaves began to turn at the edges and the air lost its heat, Abram came in from the barn with something wrapped in linen. He placed it on the table and unwrapped it slowly. It was a simple band of silver, shaped by hand, edges smoothed by care. Grace looked down at it, then up at him. "I know I'm not a man with land or a name that carries weight," he said, voice low, "but I've got my hands and I've got this heart, and both are yours, if you'll have them." She stepped close enough to feel the warmth of him. "You already gave them. This is just the part I get to keep." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she pressed her lips to his, slow and certain, with no need for more words. They married in late October, beneath the cottonwood whose leaves had turned gold. The preacher from town came out with his wife, and the widow from the store brought a pie. It was a small gathering, but every hand there was honest, and every smile real. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Abram shaved for the first time in weeks, though he kept a little of the beard she said she liked. After the vows were spoken, they walked back to the house together, hand in hand. She paused at the garden gate and looked back. "This is the life I never let myself hope for," she said. Abram kissed her temple. "Then we'll build it slow and never let it go." Years passed. The house grew fuller with each season. A second coop was added, and a child's laughter eventually filled the yard, echoing under the cottonwood. Grace taught her daughter to read by the hearth, while Abram carved her toys from leftover pine. Their days were not without hardship, but nothing ever felt quite like loss again. Evenings were spent on the porch, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't need to. And when the wind moved through the grass, it carried no ghosts, only the sound of a life well chosen and deeply loved.